All right, so we've been covering Gamergate for several weeks now. We've interviewed everybody from game developers, game journalists, game reviewers, game funders, and people tangentially and directly involved with Gamergate on both sides. And I'm getting more and more emails from people saying, David, what's your opinion of Gamergate? Because you've interviewed people from both sides. You seem to just be asking tough questions to both sides, but this is mostly an opinion program, the David Pakman Show. You must have come up with some opinions so far. And that's true. So I thought we would do this video and kind of go through what I think about this at this point. Why should people care about what I think? Maybe they shouldn't. But what I can tell you is people seem to be trying to figure out what I think. I get emails from individuals who say, David, you're so obviously in the tank for the pro Gamergate side on this issue. Can't you just admit it? You are way more fair to the pro Gamergate side than what is kind of colloquially being discussed as the anti Gamergate side. And then at the same time, people email me and they say, David, your interviews with anti Gamergate are on average longer than your interviews with pro Gamergate. It's so clear that you're trying to prop up the anti Gamergate side. And the reality is, I'm not trying to do either of those things, but I will tell you kind of what I think about this at this point. And we're going to keep covering it. We'll keep doing more interviews. My views could change. So let's go through this piece by piece, right? First of all, there's the side that says Gamergate is really about the problem of misogyny, sexism, racism, xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, etc. within the video game industry. Do I think that these are issues within the gaming industry? Of course, of course. If you do the amount of research we've done into everything that's been written from both sides about under the general umbrella of Gamergate, of course there is misogyny and there's sexism and there is a contingent of people who are talking as if the most important thing is journalistic ethics, but really they're hiding behind this meme of journalistic ethics as the number one concern in order to slut shame, in order to criticize women for their personal sex lives, in order to make personal attacks and ad hominems. Of course that's going on. Is it the only thing going on? No, of course it isn't. But that is absolutely happening. Now, is misogyny and sexism, etc., worse within video games than it is in so many other areas of American and worldwide life? I can't say that. And this is the question I've tried to ask to many of my guests, which is, what evidence do you have that sexism and misogyny is particularly egregious within the field of video gaming? And the answers there have not been overwhelmingly convincing to me. But of course there is misogyny here. And the people who are criticizing women, and we don't even have to get into names here. People can research what I'm talking about, or they might already know. Any criticism based on the amount of people a woman has had sex with, maybe to induce reviews that are positive, which ultimately never even happened, that is a disgusting criticism. It has absolutely no place. If you really want to talk about journalistic ethics and ethics in talking about video games, a woman's sexual past, in the same way that I don't care whatsoever about a man's sexual past, I don't care about a woman's sexual past. If you really want to talk about journalistic ethics in video games, that should not even be a part of it. Okay, now let's talk about journalistic ethics. Are there journalistic ethics issues within video games? Based on my research, based on my experience, based on the interviews I've done, there are absolutely issues. We see collusion that is different degrees of obvious in terms of collusion between reviewers and developers and funders. Of course that exists. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Is this the most prominent and important type of journalistic collusion and corruption that exists? I don't think it is, and I'll elaborate on that further. But for those who say that journalistic ethics are an issue, I completely agree with them. They absolutely are here, but I'll talk about that more a little bit later. Harassment. Is there harassment taking place here? Of course. How could anyone argue that there isn't? And I understand that harassment, the definition of harassment has taken on increasingly nebulous and amorphous definitions. For example, I was accused of harassment when I, on Twitter, invited someone to come onto the show for an interview and then did a dot reply on Twitter, meaning that everybody who follows me can see my reply, not just the person I'm replying to. And I was accused of harassing someone by virtue of having used that type of reply on Twitter. That, I think, is absolutely ridiculous. And even understanding the context, as some of my guests have invited me to do, I still think it's ridiculous that by offering time, just saying, here's a venue, come on and talk if you want, and if you don't, don't. The idea that that's harassment is ridiculous. But of course harassment is a part of this. We've seen doxing, we have seen threats, we have seen, as I talked about, the sexist and misogynistic and anti-gay and all sorts of ad hominems used. Harassment is an issue. Now, if you say, David, can you really tell me what percentage of the harassment is on either side? I think that there's probably not an equal amount of harassment coming from one side or the other. But how can we really even assess that, given that the Newsweek analysis that was done about negative, positive, and neutral tweets wasn't even accurate? They didn't use the right terminology. They ended up having to take back or at least shift the explanation for what they did. How can we really assess where the harassment is coming from when we have essentially a hashtag leaderless movement? I could go on Twitter right now. I'm not part of either side of this thing. I could go on Twitter and use one hashtag or use another and harass someone or harass someone else. And by virtue of that tweet, this would be considered a pro-Gamergate instance of harassment or an anti-Gamergate instance of harassment or victimization of those who are pro or anti. How can we really assess that in an honest way? What's abundantly clear to me is that while there are people on both sides of this thing that are trying to have honest and rational discussions, there are people on both sides of this thing that are choosing to harass and choosing to insult and choosing to use ad hominems. And it's pretty disgusting. And if you're trying to focus on misogyny or journalistic ethics or whatever, the harassment that's going on is not really going to do too much for your side, whatever side it is that you're on. Now let's get back to those on the pro-Gamergate side that are 100% focused on journalistic issues. I want to speak specifically to one group, okay? As far as my opinion goes. Let's assume you are not participating in any kind of harassment. Let's assume you are not participating in any kind of ad hominem attacks. You are not one of these individuals who is using the meme of journalistic ethics as an excuse to slut shame or criticize women or disparage people. I only want to talk to the people that are truly honestly concerned about journalistic ethics. I already said earlier in this video that I believe that that is a real issue. But is this the number one issue? When I think about all of the issues that I cover, is ethics in video game reviews the number one issue? No, it's not. And when I think about water shortages in California and in different parts of the world and possible wars over water resources, when I think about foreign policy and war and what's going on with ISIS and what's going on with American imperialism and all of these issues, that's more important to me than journalistic ethics with regard to video games. Climate change, education. We have religious nuts rewriting textbooks in Texas to do revisionist history with a religious worldview. That, to me, is much more important than video game reviews. I will admit that. Money in politics. Money in politics is ruining our democracy, essentially. Princeton study recently assessed that we don't even really have a democracy anymore. We have an oligarchy. That's more important to me than ethics in video game journalism. Space travel. I mean, we're talking now about a contract for Boeing and SpaceX to shuttle American astronauts to the International Space Station. We're talking about a Mars mission. That's more important to me than video game journalism. It just strikes me as a more important issue to society as a whole. The corporate media being increasingly bad and untrustworthy and influenced by advertisers. That's a bigger issue than journalistic ethics in video games. Right-wingers trying to control women's bodies and saying, if you want to have an abortion, a legal medical procedure, we as politicians are going to mandate that you have a transvaginal ultrasound. That's more important to me than journalistic ethics. Incarceration and the war on drugs, that to me matters more than journalistic ethics in video games. Does this mean that for a second I think that journalistic ethics is not a problem, that there isn't corruption or collusion in video games? Of course not. Absolutely not. I've made it absolutely clear that that clearly does exist. But I think that some of the emails I get, and I understand, I have friends who are very involved in the Gamergate world and they're following what's going on. And they say to me, David, I recognize that we're talking about video games at the end of the day. And yes, there are, you can connect the journalistic ethics issues in Gamergate to broader issues in the world at large. I agree. You can connect the slut shaming and victim blaming in Gamergate to issues in the world at large. And I completely agree with that. But the unhinged focus, the apoplectic knee-jerk reactions that the journalistic ethics issues in video games are the issue of our time, the emails I get from people just fixated and obsessed with this, I don't sympathize with those, in the sense that I don't get when we have climate change, foreign policy, war, religion violating the separation of church and state, incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders, education is just exploding and it's just a disaster. We increasingly have policies that are subjugating all sorts of minority groups in this country, et cetera, et cetera. To say that, there's misogyny in video games because the female characters are in stereotypically weak women's roles and subservient. Yeah, that's an issue, but that's not the number one issue for me. Yeah, we see freebies being offered by video game developers, and that really is tainting reviews. I agree that that's existing, but this is not the number one issue for me. So that's my view on this. And in the same way that every single interview I've done has brought hate and allegations that I'm clearly biased to one side or the other, I hope that this video, I know it will bring hate, and I know that people will criticize me and they will say, David, you were more dismissive of the journalistic ethics claims than of the misogyny claims, or you were more critical of the misogyny claims than the journalistic ethics claims. The reality is, I do see both sides of this thing, but when it comes to the end of the day, I see a lot of people that are properly contextualizing this issue within the broader world. And if you saw my inbox, if you saw what was going on with my email inbox, there are some people that seem to be taking this a little too seriously. And when I say that, I don't mean that people being harassed and doxxed aren't serious issues. That part is not the part that I'm saying isn't serious. That is, of course, very, very serious. But the broader concern over video game journalism as the be-all, end-all lens through which we analyze our world, I can't get behind that. And I hope people understand that is not, for the average person, when they wake up, that's not the number one lens through which they're analyzing the world. Send me your thoughts. Am I crazy? Is this an insane view? I know that some of my colleagues have done analyses where they give their opinions, and they're absolutely hammered in the YouTube comments, on Twitter, etc. People have been asking for my opinion. This is what my opinion is. I will continue to do fair interviews. I will continue to research every single interview the way I've been doing, and I'll keep you apprised of any changes to my personal opinion on this.